Um, the in your book Reason and Wonder, you talk about a third Copernican revolution, and that what it boils down to is consciousness has been left out of the materialist paradigm of science. And you give example that if we get an electromagnetic wave, the brain translates it to red. So there's lots of activities of the brain that don't just record data, it shapes reality. So could you comment on that?
Sure, I'll try. I'll give it a go. Well, first of all, the thesis of the book is that we can sort of map human evolution, or the evolution of human consciousness, through three successive Copernican revolutions, and there's some overlap between them. The first, of course, being due to Copernicus himself, who redefined our place in the physical cosmos. And in a way, Big Bang cosmology is sort of the Copernican revolution playing out, in a way. So what we're calling Copernican revolutions are revolutions that originate in science, but they have implications, profound implications for human understanding of who we are and where we fit in the cosmos. And so the original Copernican revolution redefined our physical place in the cosmos. We're not the center of everything that we thought we were. Then Freud said that Darwinism was the second blow to human narcissism. We thought that we were on this planet through sort of divine fiat, and that we there was a special creation of all creatures, and we were made at the top of the heap in the image of God. And we find out from Darwin that it's really very much a random process, evolution is, in that we are no different in kind from the other creatures, only in degree. So it's a second blow to human narcissism. And I would say we're in the middle of that revolution, because these revolutions can take centuries to play out. And we're not at the end of that revolution, because if you poll Americans for the last 40 or 50 years, about 50% say that human beings were created more or less in their present form within the last 10,000 years. So about half of Americans adhere to a biblical view of creation, despite a lot of scientific evidence to the contrary. Now, these two Copernican revolutions were largely the work of individuals, Copernicus and Darwin. The third Copernican revolution, this is not really, this categorization is not unique to me. I thought it was when I first started writing the book, but nothing is ever original. And I found out that there are a lot of, or at least there's quite a few people who had a similar characterization. For example, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. It'll come back to me. But I actually met someone who wrote a book about time, a physicist who wrote a book about time, who referred to a third Copernican revolution. And actually, Freud, when he said Darwinism was the second blow to human narcissism, he was actually sort of surreptitiously claiming credit for the third, because he thought dealing with the human psyche would be the third.
With the unconscious.
The unconscious, or I mean, to Freud, I guess, yes, conscious and unconscious. So anyway, Darwin redefined our place in the biological cosmos. And the third Copernican revolution, which I would argue we're just really entering, we're barely into, is going to redefine our place in the psychic cosmos, the spiritual cosmos, or the or in terms of consciousness. And I am being very loose here, but I personally don't distinguish very strongly between consciousness, psyche, and spirituality. To me, they're all quite similar. I'm sure theologians would draw all kinds of fine lines between those. But for me, I'm perfectly happy to, if one is a religious person, then use the word spirituality. If you're not, then think psyche or consciousness. But it's all part of, for me, it's all part of spirituality. Now, unlike the other Copernican revolutions, the third one, I think, really in some ways got kicked off by the scientific revolution of quantum mechanics or quantum theory. And so in that regard, it's really the work not of individuals so much as the accumulation of contributions from many, many people, because quantum mechanics has really turned our view of the material world on its head.
How so?
Well, if you go back to Descartes, who divided the world into the res extensa and the res cogitans, if I'm not butchering the Latin. Res extensa is the extended thing, or what's out there, and the res cogitans is the thinking thing. So he separated the world into the physical world, what's out there, and the thinking being us. That's called the Cartesian partition. He divided mind from matter. And philosophy prior to that was largely integrated. And so what happened is he paved the way for science to take the material world as its domain, and for philosophy and religion to take the mental or spiritual or psychic world for their domain. And those two domains split. And we've been, to use the term schizophrenic in the vernacular, we've been sort of schizophrenic ever since. And so science has been largely focused on the material world, what can be observed through the primary senses about the material world. But one of the things that happened with quantum mechanics is the rending of the Cartesian partition, because the Cartesian, in the scientific view of Descartes, there was an objective observer and there was a thing being observed, and the observer had no effect on the thing being observed. And we now know that at the quantum level, at least, anything that one does to determine the quantum state affects the object being observed. Now that happens at a microscopic level, at the level of the elementary particles. But nevertheless, that has, strictly speaking, you cannot separate the observer from the observed. And so the observer is always part of whatever the experiment is, and the observer is not completely objective. And of course, there's been all kinds of experiments to play that out. And one of the things you mentioned that you wanted to talk about was Einstein. Of course, Einstein was a strict determinist. He got that from Spinoza, who was a Jewish philosopher that he greatly admired. But Spinoza was very much a determinist, and Einstein was a determinist to his core, and he really couldn't stomach the sort of random, non-deterministic aspects of quantum mechanics. And for example, it goes back even before Einstein. When a radioactive atom decays, you can't predict when it's going to decay and give off a beta particle or an alpha particle. If you have a whole lump of radium with lots and lots of radioactive atoms, you can predict the characteristics of a whole bunch of atoms decaying, because it will decay exponentially in time. But if you've got a single atom, it's a random process as to when it's going to decay. And so that introduces an element of uncertainty or randomness, indeterminacy into physics. And Einstein believes strictly in causality, he believes strictly in determinism, and yet here is this non-deterministic element, and the same thing happens when a charged atom decays and emits a photon of light. And this is studied by the science of spectroscopy. When you pass light through a prism, you get a rainbow of colors. But if you pass light that emanates from certain atoms, like a cesium atom through a prism, you get a rainbow of colors with very bright lines at particular places. It's called the Fraunhofer spectrum. And for a long time it wasn't understood, but now we know that that when a particular atom is excited so that some of its electrons are in higher orbitals, if it decays to a less excited state, it will give off photons of light, but those photons have a very particular energy or a very particular color. And so that's where these bands come in the Fraunhofer spectrum. Now, that was completely not understood until quantum mechanics came along. Niels Bohr's new model of the atom explained those lines very carefully, but still, when a particular orbital or electron jumps to a different orbital, no one can predict. And that caused a lot of heartburn for many of the original quantum physicists. Einstein said famously, if an electron is going to decide of its own free will, not only when it's going to jump, but where, he said, I would rather be a cobbler or an employee in a gaming industry than a physicist.
And you quote him as saying, God doesn't play dice.
God doesn't play dice, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was in this great exchange with Niels Bohr, and Bohr responded, Albert, stop telling God what to do.
So the fact of free will implies consciousness, right? So that consciousness is at play even at the subatomic level.
Well, we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves there, because when Einstein used that phrase, he didn't believe that. That was a sort of pejorative for him, that an electron couldn't have free will.
Right.
But over time, more and more people have been accepting the possibility that maybe an electron does have a quantum of free will. And one of the thrills in my experience of writing the book, in 2009, I got to visit both Larry LeShan, a pioneering experimental psychologist, and Freeman Dyson, pioneering mathematical physicist, both in their 90s. At the time, Freeman Dyson was at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, which is where Einstein was. He knew Einstein. And in one of his books, he had entertained the idea of there being a quantum of free will. And of course, he has sort of made his scientific career being a bit of an iconoclast, but I wanted to know whether I had interpreted him correctly. So I asked him over lunch, point blank, if he actually accepted that point of view, and he said yes, yeah. If that were to be the case, then there's a proto-consciousness of sorts would exist all the way down. And that makes a lot more sense to me than the sort of scientific materialistic point of view, is that, well, it's all material, it's all material, it's all material until you get beings of a certain complexity, and then poof, magically that materialism somehow gives rise to an emerging consciousness. And one of the thinkers that I've read that has spoken to me deeply is Teilhard de Chardin, who was the French paleontologist, also a Jesuit father. And Teilhard, he said, there's neither spirit nor matter in the world. There's only spirit-matter. No other substance than this could have produced the human molecule.
Spirit hides, Hides, in matter?
Repeat that question, please.
You said spirit hides in matter, Hides?
No, spirit hyphen.
Ah.
Spirit hyphen matter.
Got it.
So, and he said, no other substance but that could have produced the human molecule, the human being. And he talks about the within and the without, of that everything has two faces. The without is the material phase, and science studies the material properties, the things that can be measured and quantified. But everything, all the way down to the elementary particle, also has a psychic phase or a spiritual phase, or a consciousness. And Teilhard would say that consciousness, as you go farther down towards the elementary particles, that consciousness is a spectrum whose shades are lost in the night. In other words, when you get to the very bottom, all you see is proto-consciousness, the beginnings, the shades of consciousness. But to me, that makes a lot more sense than the kind of miraculous view that somehow it's all material, and then at some critical mass, all of a sudden consciousness emerges.
Let me ask you this. Do they now think that quarks are the smallest particles we know about, or then there's string theory, these little vibrating strings? What do physicists think now is the smallest that we can be aware of?
Well, I'm an applied mathematician, and so I really can't address that question. But I mean, I think in the standard model of physics, quarks are as far down as you can go.
Because I'm wondering if they have free will in some ways. Because there's up quarks and down quarks and this kind of quark and that kind of quark.
Yeah, but once again, what I'm suggesting here is not at all the common view among physicists or scientists. It would really be a view in the minority. But once again, I would say that we're at the beginning of a Copernican revolution, the very beginning, maybe 50 years or 60 years into it, that could play out for centuries, because the other Copernican revolutions have played out for centuries.
Except everything speeds up now.
Well, in some ways it needs to, I guess, because we're in pretty deep trouble. Yes, but I mean, what I'm proposing here is not by any means a mainstream view. Um,
But
and I guess,
it's a fact that electrons act randomly. You can't really predict what.
that, sure. Yeah, we don't know. You can't predict. Now, whether that's a result of some kind of proto-consciousness or not is open. And I guess I might go on record here taking slight issue with one of your questions about, well, it was phrased that quantum mechanics explains a lot about consciousness. From my point of view, trying to be somewhat scientific about this, I would say that there are a lot of parallels and there are a lot of hints, but I don't think we're anywhere close to explaining consciousness. And if you look at, I know you interviewed Larry Dossey, and he was one of the authors or principal authors of the Manifesto for a Post-Materialistic Science. I think what that manifesto is saying, look, there's a lot that we call the paranormal, which is normal, really, because it's ubiquitous, but we call it the paranormal because we don't understand it. But just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not a legitimate thing for science to study. And yes, it does seem to violate, paranormal phenomena do seem to violate a lot of science's sacred cows. But guess what? None of those sacred cows are necessary for science to be science. And so this manifesto is saying, let's study these phenomena that we don't understand with the same tools that we've studied the material world. These are legitimate things to study. But that's very different from saying quantum mechanics explains consciousness. That to me is probably 2 or 3 centuries of investigation into the future. Okay.
If we make it. What about quantum non-locality, the influence of entangled particles on each other even from a distance? That's kind of the most provocative part of quantum mechanics to me.
Yeah, I have to tell a little bit of a story here because I quote Henry Stapp in my book. And Stapp said, I believe the quote is, that Bell's theorem, which has to do with non-locality, is the most important discovery of physics. And I love that quote, and I quoted him, but I didn't have any inkling of who he was or what his pedigree was, or whether he was still living or not. I just liked the quote, and I thought perhaps he's someone not particularly well respected because he would make such a bold statement. Well, I met him 2 years ago at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in California. By the way, that should be on your list of organizations. Very, very high-powered conference, Science and Non-Duality. And I met Henry Stapp. I asked him, I think he's about 84, 85 now. Nice gentleman. He also gave a riveting talk. But I asked him, I said, did you really say that Bell's theorem is the most profound discovery of physics? And he says, no. I said it's the most important discovery of physics. So I had misquoted one word. But it turns out that he studied, he has an incredible pedigree. I think he studied both with Niels Bohr and with Werner Heisenberg. And he spent his career at Lawrence Livermore Labs. So the guy, he's first rate. But so that was a thrill for me to meet him. I didn't even know that he was still living. But yeah, and Bell's non-locality is an experimental, originates from an experiment based on Bell's theorem. Bell's theorem is based on a so-called paradox that Einstein and collaborators came up with in 1935 called the Epr Paradox. Epr standing for the letters of the names of the three people who proposed it, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. And in physics, mass is conserved, energy is conserved, momentum is conserved. And Einstein realized that certain processes gave rise to, say, two photons, which would travel away from one another at the speed of light. And according to the current interpretation of quantum mechanics, each photon had a spin, and a spin is a type of angular momentum. For photons, spin and polarization are the same thing. But according to the interpretation of quantum mechanics, the spin existed only as a probability until the measurement was made. So if you make a measurement on one photon, then in order for momentum to be preserved, the other one has to change its spin to keep the momentum preserved. Once the state is known for one, it has to be known for the other. But Einstein said, well, that would require some kind of communication between these two photons. And they can't communicate because they're traveling away from each other, each moving at the speed of light. So there's no process of communication. And so that existed as a full-blown paradox with no resolution until 1965, when I think it was John Stuart Bell, an Irish physicist, said, wait a minute. He could conceive of an experiment where you could actually test the correlation between these particles. And if Einstein was right, one set of correlations would hold. And if quantum mechanics was right, then these things also always had to be correlated with one another, okay, no matter how far apart they were. So there it sat for another 6 years or so until about 1971 or 72 when, and this happened at Lawrence Livermore Labs, when I think I'm getting my physicists mixed up. I want to say Alan Aspect, but he might have been the French physicist. Anyway, they realized they could actually perform this experiment. And they did. And sure enough, the correlations always bear out quantum mechanics. The particles, if they're well, and over the years, these experiments have been more and more refined. And quantum mechanics is always comes out being verified as completely legitimate. So there went non-locality. Or one way of thinking about it is that once entangled, always entangled. In other words, you can't. There's many ways to think of this. One is that there's some kind of superluminal, faster than light communication between particles. Another way to think of it is our whole notion of space, though, is a mental construct. And I'm struck by the wisdom of the ancients. In the Sanskrit are these three Sanskrit words that are interpreted, that art thou, or thou art that, and which I think is really the fundamental tenet of all good religions. That there's there's really no separation between self and other, that separation is an illusion. In science, the separation between the object and the observed is really an illusion, because you can't really do the experiment without the observer as part of the experimental apparatus. And in essence, non-locality is saying what appears to be this enormous separation is not, that these twin particles in some sense are not, if they're entangled, they're not separate. You have to consider them as one system. And so that would almost say that the distance between them is artificial in some way. It's a mental construct.
That's mind-boggling. Well, one of the scientists that I interviewed said a possibility is precognition, that the one entangled particle precogs very quickly that the other is going to change its spin. Who knows?
There's all kinds of, there's all kinds of interpretations. Maybe there is superluminal communication. Another is separation is illusion. Another, there's all kinds of possible interpretations, but because of that, it's important not to say that quantum mechanics explains telepathy.
It's very tempting. It's very tempting to say, oh, there's an information field, ESP,
right,
prayer at a distance, all that is explained by this communication field, it's information field. But we don't have evidence of that.
Not yet, yeah. So I think from a scientific point of view, it's like you said, it's really tempting to latch on to all of this and say, aha. I think that's dangerous in the long run, because it gives ammunition to those who would say this is pseudoscience, this is not legit, because scientists try to be very careful not to overstate the case.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the evidence that there is something other than material. You quote Schrodinger, who says, thoughts and feelings are outside of matter. Mind is an intangible ghost. We need a new paradigm for how to relate the local brain to the mind. So you mentioned telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, distant healing, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. So how do we know that those things really do exist and they're just not pseudoscience or giving people cues or cheating in some way? How do we know that those phenomena really exist?
Well, first of all, I think they're ubiquitous. I think if you ask, well, I've done this with students in certain classes. I wouldn't do this with all classes, but I've taught honors classes, and I have the impression that at least half of all of humanity has had some experience that just doesn't fit our normal mode of thinking.
Someone's going to call you. The phone's ringing. Oh, it's my mother.
Right. Or a mystical experience, or an out-of-body experience, or a near-death experience, or a precognitive dream. And this stuff is not rare. I mean, almost everybody has had this. Now, so you either write off half or more of the human population as flakes, or liars, or both.
Or crazy.
Or you say, okay, something is there. What's going on? And that's exactly what Larry LeShan did. I mentioned meeting him. He's now, I think, 96 or 98. And that was a great thrill to meet him. But he wrote two books that really touched me. One was The Medium, the Mystic, and the Physicist, written in 1966, which he re-released in 2002. And the only thing he changed was the preface. So that book is still an important book. The other book he wrote, and it's a tiny little book called How to Meditate. It sold more than 1 million copies. He told me it wrote itself, meaning he didn't really struggle to write it. It just flowed out of him. It's only maybe 120 or 30 pages long. It's a small book, but it's an amazing book because it is a reference not only for people who are starting meditation, but for practitioners who have been in it a long time. And one of the chapters that spoke a lot to me was the chapter on what mystics, and the term mystic is a much maligned and much misunderstood term. And Larry does just a wonderful job of explaining in lay terms what a mystic is. But why I bring him up is I mentioned in the written answers I gave to you that when he was right out of graduate school, a young, newly minted Ph.D., feeling his oats, he was going to go out there and shoot down all of this paranormal nonsense. And he said he made a mistake, and this is exactly how he says it. I made a mistake. I looked at the data. And even then, early in his career, and he's almost 100 years old now, there were mountains of evidence collected over a century. And because people are so skeptical of this stuff, a lot of the experiments were done very, very carefully controlled. And he, once he looked at the data, he says, okay, the phenomena are real. So we've got to understand it. And he was very pragmatic. He said, okay, there's telepathy, there's clairvoyance, there's distant healing, blah, blah, blah. He says, I don't need to study telepathy. We have telephones. Okay. So he chose to study healing. Mm-hmm. And he's been credited by some. He does not claim credit for this, but he's been credited by others for being the father of sort of mind-body medicine. And he actually, he and some his proteges put together a meditation for healing workshop, which I went to in 2005. It was led by a woman named Joyce Goodrich, who passed away a few years thereafter. And Larry says, okay, I want to, it's clear that there are some people who have a healing gift. I want to understand that. And he studied Eileen Garrett, who was a very well-known, well-respected psychic, a healer. And he became very good friends with her. And he realized that when she was in a healing modality, that she was in an altered state of consciousness. And he started sort of trying to characterize this altered state of consciousness. And as he's trying to understand it and characterize it, he realizes that it's a sense of deja vu, that he's seen it before, and it's sort of a state of mystical awareness. So that's the medium and the mystic in his book, The Medium, the Mystic, and the Physicist. He also made friends with Henry Morgenau, who was a very well-respected physicist at Yale University. And at the time, Larry was living, well, he still lives in New York. And he would travel on a Wednesday every week to Connecticut, to New Haven on the train, spend the afternoon with Henry Morgenau. So the medium, the mystic, and the physicist. And they would just discuss all of this stuff, the parallels between human consciousness and modern physics. And over the years, they accumulated a bunch of quotations, half from modern physicists and half from ancient mystics. Then they shuffled them, scrambled them up, and gave them to Morgenau's physics graduate students and asked them to say, okay, whose is whose? And they only got it about 60% of the time. There's that much overlap between what the ancient mystics are saying and what the modern physicists are saying. So anyway, to Larry's credit, he spent the lion's share of his life trying to understand what he initially set out to refute.
You also mentioned his book, 2009, A New Science of the Paranormal.
Yeah. Now when he wrote that, he was very much up in years, about 90. He has some really sweet ways of putting things. His way of describing the current state of psychology is that he feels like a jilted lover, because psychology back in the 70s went heavily into behavioralism and Skinnerism, which was a way of just treating psychology in a materialistic paradigm. And so he was very troubled by that. And so this book about a theory of the paranormal, I would say it's not a necessarily solid theory so much as a way of trying to help psychology take a deep look at itself where it's failed. Okay? But it's, to say theory, I think I'm not sure nobody's there yet in some ways to really call it a theory of the paranormal, but it's sort of a foundation for studying the paranormal and the legitimacy of the paranormal.
So is that the main point, that it is a legitimate field?
Yeah, to be honest, it's been 10 years since I read that. And it didn't, I'm not a psychologist, it didn't reach me at the deep level it did, his other books did. And I didn't feel it was quite as profound. But I also have a good friend here at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Greg Henriques, who also just bemoans the fact that psychology is so fragmented, and psychology has, as a discipline, has no foundation. It's all over the map. All kinds of different modalities for counseling, all kinds of different theories for understanding the human being and the mind. And so I know enough psychologists to know that there's a lot of ashes and sackcloth about psychology, that it's somehow lost its moorings, and it really needs to regain those moorings.
Especially because psychiatrists now rely so much on pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
So it's not even we're working through your core issues, we're just going to deal with the symptoms, and
right.
So you're less anxious.
Henry James, to me, psychology has gone downhill a lot since Henry James.
Right. Carl Jung was another psychoanalyst who talked about the importance of the unconscious, not just Freud, his colleague. But what's interesting is he said that we share a collective unconscious. I think that's kind of contribution of Jung, right? That he says it's identical in all individuals, a shared unconscious or consciousness.
Yeah, and you interviewed Henry Reed. Henry's a friend of mine. And I actually watched the whole 2-hour interview.
That's a feat.
And Henry is an originator of the dream, one of the two originators of the Dream Helper ceremony, which is, in his interview, Henry talked about being an inventor. It's really an invention. To me, it's not a proof, but I have experienced that dream helper ceremony 6 times. And it's the closest thing I know of to an experiential proof of a shared subconscious.
Can you give an example of something that convinced you, a dream?
Well, I know Henry explained it to you. Maybe for the sake of completeness, I'll give an outline of what happens. It's a protocol for intentional dreaming for altruistic purposes. Normally done in a group of 8 to 10 people, and you can have multiple groups going simultaneously. One person is a focus person, and they volunteer to do this. That's very important. They're a volunteer. And they have some issue that they're dealing with. It could be a relational issue, a vocational issue, a health issue. They do not divulge that issue to the group. They only say that they're willing for the group to offer them help through their dreams. And this usually happens on a Friday night. And then each person in the circle, maybe 8 people, says individually to the focus person, so I, Dave, promise you, Gail, that tonight I will have a dream that will help you. All 8 people do that. Then we all go home. Then the next day you come back and process those dreams. Still, the focus person is sitting in the circle and they hear all of these dreams. And again, it's completely dreaming in the dark in the sense that we have no conscious awareness of what the issue is. Now, let me tell you 2 things. No matter how skeptical you are about this, there are 3 things that are irrefutable. If you ask people randomly, how many of you remember a dream from last night? The normal-ish incidence of remembered dreams is from 20% to 25%. So roughly 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 4 will remember a dream they had last night. Once you have promised the focus person that you're going to dream for them, the incidence of remembered dreams is in excess of 95%. Now, so that's phenomenal in its own regard. Second, now Henry was giving a major talk at University of Virginia when he had an epiphany in the middle of his talk. And he had done this group hundreds, if not thousands of times. No one ever asked him, Henry, how do you have a dream for another person? Now, when you think about it rationally, the only rational way to think about it is, you're crazy. How can I have a dream for another person? Nobody, and thousands of people, had ever asked that question, including me. So, at some level, we must think that's possible. Now, the third thing is, which is really telling, people are terrified of this experience, but not the focus person. Now, on the one hand, it could seem voyeuristic because it might seem like one is trying to read the mind of the focus person. But first of all, the focus person is a volunteer. They are asking for help. So if there isn't an opening of some kind of ego or consciousness boundaries, it's a voluntary opening. But the people who are terrified are in the group. And you know why? And this is universal. Everybody is terrified that they will come the next morning and not have a dream for the focus person.
Mm.
They are terrified of letting down the person they promised. And that is ubiquitous. Everybody feels that way. I felt that way. And Henry gives them a way out. He says, if you don't remember a dream, write down the first thing you remember in the morning. So you're still tapping into some intuitive place. And so when you put all of that together, at some level, we're accepting that we can help the other person. Now, I've experienced the group 6 times. The first time, the group process was not so important to me. For some reason, the group process did not seem that significant. But 2 of the 4 most profound dreams I ever had in my entire life, I had that night to bring in to the focus person. And those dreams were both prescient dreams. They were about things that would happen in the future. The other times I have witnessed the power of this process on the focus person. The last time, the first person who spoke had been the only one person in the group who did not have a dream, but he wrote down the first thing he remembered in the morning. And as soon as he started sharing that, the focus person broke into tears. Mm. Then I was second. I had a dream. I laid out my dream. The focus person broke into tears again. And we all process this. And even though, as Henry said, all the dreams are different, there will be a common theme. And more times than not, that common theme is actually significant to the issue that the person is dealing with.
Can you give us an example?
Well, it's a little tricky because, we promise that what happens in the group stays in the group. But, I don't even remember who was in the group the last time.
What about when you had the presentient dreams? Do you remember what you...
Oh, yes. I think I can share the group experience without divulging a confidentiality. But yes, I had 2 dreams. One of them was of a railroad track on a very flat, straight railroad track. And an egg was sitting on one of the rails. And I'm walking on the rail, hitting that egg with my toe. And the egg is rolling down the rail. And this was right after I had started my book, which took 12 years to write. And the interpretation from the group was that an egg symbolizes life or creativity.
New
and
beginnings.
The straight road track was basically keep doing what you're doing and something will come from it. The other dream was a little bit troubling at the time. I play a guitar, not great, but it's an instrument that's been a good friend to me over more than half a lifetime. And I had a dream that in this dream was a guitar. It was a cheap one where the bridge is held on by a piece of metal that is bent over the body of the guitar and screwed in, and that the guitar had gotten wet, and that the piece of metal had pulled out and the tension and all the strings had released. And that, during the night, that was a troubling dream, because it's like the guitar is broken. So we processed in the circle, and I found out that water is a symbol of healing in dreams. It often is symbolic of some kind of cleansing or healing. Well, after that experience, which happened in Sedona, Arizona, of all places, I'm a person who carries a tremendous amount of inner tension. I'm a pretty anxious person. My inner tension evaporated completely for 4 months. For 4 months.
Wow.
After this conference. And it wasn't until after I had a misunderstanding with another person in September, this happened in May, that I resorted to my previous state. And there were other things about this that, I've had self-image issues my whole life. I had a change in pattern of self-image for that period of time. And I lost my fear of death for that period of time. And then ultimately I reverted to a normal, a much more unfortunate normal state. But so that very first time, even though I wasn't the focus person, and I've never been the focus person, those two dreams were incredibly significant for me. One of them was giving me guidance to just keep doing what I'm doing and trust that it will pan out. And the other was really predicting a future change of my own inner consciousness. Going back to the other side of things, though, when I've done this group before, I've done it with my honor students and then invited faculty and community members in to participate. So it's a combination of willing participants, students, community members, faculty. Now, most people are quite skeptical. Let me put it another way, most of the outside world would be quite skeptical. But so you could argue that the people who do this are self-initiating into the experience. But that doesn't mean that not everyone is skeptical. I was skeptical in the beginning as well. But my wife went the last time, and I think she was kind of skeptical. And it was a very powerful experience for her. And it was a healing experience for the focus person in her workshop, in her group. And in my group, as I recall, there was a woman who had a younger brother who was having, I think, mental health issues. And she felt like she should be protecting him in some way, and she wasn't able to. My dream had to do with two furry little animals. I don't know, gophers or almost squirrel-like animals, little gophers who are walking along together, maybe on their hind legs, and all of a sudden one rolls up into a little ball next to the other. And she immediately identified that with her relationship with her brother that she felt like she needed to protect. And so I've done this 6 times with I don't know how many circles. I've only known one circle to go awry, and that was because of a person who really did not bring the altruistic experience with him and became judgmental within the group.
It's power tripping.
Yeah. But, and I think I've been able actually to offer Henry some perspective on the whole thing, that it's so powerfully altruistic because, not despite, but because you don't know what the issue is initially. And so you come with a sense, I'm not trying to fix this person, I'm only trying to be available to them. Now, the way it works is once you go through the dreams once everybody shares the dream, then the focused person does reveal the issue, and then you mine the dreams again to see if there's more wisdom. So they ultimately reveal the issue, but it's not until after all the dreams have been processed once. So initially, you're not trying to fix this person. You're just there to be available to them. But the other thing I've said to Henry, and this is where we disagree, it's a very powerful experience. And so it could, anything that's powerful could go awry. And so Henry says he wants a lot of lay leaders to do this. And I would never do this except for people I already know. I would never want to do this for someone if there was a group of people I didn't know and somebody might be on the psychological edge and I wasn't aware of it, because it is powerful, it could go awry. But Henry is a trained psychologist, so if something started to go awry, he would be there to intervene. But nevertheless, to me, the experiences, you could say, well, dreams are they're general enough that you could find meaning in any dream. And there's probably some truth in that, but when you realize that a pattern often arises, not sometimes arises, it often arises when people come into this with the right attitude, it really suggests to me some kind of
collective unconscious.
Collective unconscious. And when I talk to my students about it, I don't try to sell that. But I remember the comment of one of the students. She said, yeah, we're dipping our toes in the great pool of collective unconscious. That was the student's term. We're dipping our toes in the pool of collective unconscious.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned Roger Penrose. I'm arguing for some kind of active role for consciousness in physics, and indeed a powerful one. Wolfgang Pauli, it would be most satisfactory of all if physics and psyche could be seen as complementary aspects of the same reality. And Eugene Wigner, consciousness must be introduced into the law of physics. You mentioned Dean Radin's 1997 book, The Conscious Universe, Charles Tart, The End of Materialism. Is there anyone else that you think is a key thinker in creating the third Copernican revolution?
Well, when you read those to me, I had them all those quotes on the slide. And one of my dear friends, who's a very strict materialistic physicist, told me, Dave, you have cherry-picked all of those quotes. I don't think I have. So you're asking, though, if...
Have we left out someone who's crucial in making the third revolution?
Well, I mean, Freeman Dyson, I think, is another one who, I mentioned in the beginning about his belief that, that elementary particles do have a quantum of consciousness. Now, I don't know how he would feel about being listed there or not. There's, let's see. Arthur Eddington said the stuff of the universe is mind stuff. Arthur Eddington was was he a royal astronomer? He was one of the few experts in relativity theory, general relativity. He did the initial experiments that helped to verify Einstein's theory of relativity, doing an eclipse, a solar eclipse, where he measured the bending of light as it passes close to the sun. But Eddington said, he wrote an article called in not in praise of and not in support of, but in something of mysticism. So here's a physicist, a relativist, and he concludes, the stuff of the universe is mind stuff. And then there is thermodynamicist. Oh gosh, there's a James in his name. I'm drawing a blank. But he said the universe is beginning to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Mathematical thermodynamicist. Now again, though, my cat is pestering me, Gail. She's hungry. Could we pause this long enough for me to feed her and come back?
Sure. No problem.
Yeah. Don't go away, okay? I shall return.
Okay.
All right, be right back.
Okay.
Karen, come on. Let's go get... Okay, I'm back, Gail. Before I forget, you mentioned starting as a high school teacher. I did too. I started teaching high school math. So.
I didn't mention it, but I did. I taught junior high and high school history.
Well, I read you had a little bit of a bio in that written stuff that you sent me.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was good service.
Mm-hmm.
Teach 5 classes a day.
Oh man, yeah, it's the hardest I've ever worked.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also, you love Teilhard de Chardin and the noosphere, Noosphere. He says there's kind of a third dimension of spirit. How would you define the noosphere?
Let me back up a little bit, if it's okay.
Sure.
Because I'll get to Teilhard. But when you talk about paradigm shifts, the old paradigm is that it all starts. We're really talking about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Mm. And in the old paradigm, it's materialism, and somehow out of the material world emerges consciousness. And then Immanuel Kant tried to turn that on its head, and he asked the question, how does the representation make the reality possible? In other words, he's saying that it's how does consciousness and the representation in the brain give rise to the material world? And he thought he was starting another Copernican revolution when he asked that question. So that turns the paradigm on its head. But there's a third way. And the third way is that matter and spirit coexist. And they're flip sides of the same coin. And that it's spirit all the way down to the smallest particle of matter.
So the chicken and the egg came at the same time.
Yes. Yes. And that's Teilhard's point of view.
Uh-huh.
That everything has the within and the without, the internal face and the external face. Science studies the external face, but there's also a within. I really resonate with that because I read, for a reason I don't fully understand, I resonate with Native American mythology and spirituality. And Native Americans grant spirit to everything.
Animism.
And I was actually surprised that Henry, he quoted, he referenced Native Americans' spirituality quite a bit in his interview, and he mentioned the Lakota password, Mitakuye Oyasin, which translates, literally means all my relatives, but the meaning is much deeper than that. It really means I am related to everything and everything is related to me. Not just other humans, but the ant people and the bear people and the buffalo people and the tree people and the stone people. So I've always liked that philosophy because even if it's wrong, it makes everything an I-thou encounter rather than an I-it encounter. And God knows we need that with regard to Mother Earth at this point in time. So whether it's the way the world really works or not, it seems to me the way to live. And so finding that same philosophy in Teilhard is something I really like, that it's spirit all the way down to, if you look at where we are and you go backwards through evolution to where it all started with the Big Bang and elementary particles, well, there's spirit there at the very beginning. And where I really think things get wonderful is when Teilhard likens evolution to the process of bees making honey from the nectar dispersed all around. In other words, it is a counter-entropic process where evolution is gathering together higher and higher degrees of consciousness from the proto-consciousness that's scattered all about like the grains of pollen all over the field of flowers. And that to me is a wonderful analogy. And I've realized in writing the book that it's more than an analogy. There's actually a science behind that. And that's where things get, for me, really exciting. And that was that little paper I sent to you on Teilhard, entropy, and love. Okay, I don't know if you had a chance to read that.
You bet.
Mm-hmm. Oh, but you mentioned the noosphere. The interesting thing about that is that Teilhard was a paleontologist. He was a scientist, and a really good scientist. He was inducted into both of France's premier scientific bodies. He published many volumes of scientific works. He was also an incredible human being, and he volunteered to serve as a stretcher bearer in the First World War. As a Catholic, he was assigned to a regiment of Moroccan sharpshooters. So they were Muslim. Mm. So here's this Catholic priest risking his life on a daily basis to minister to the wounded and dying Moroccan sharpshooters. And they so revered him that they gave him this, they bestowed on him this term that meant something like blessed by God. To make things even more remarkable, Teilhard was decorated for bravery time and time again, and each one of these decorations would have allowed him to be promoted and then probably get off the battlefield. He refused all the promotions so that he could stay and minister to this one group. And still amazingly, he wound up writing the seeds, little essays that were seeds to many of his great works while in trenches on the battlefield in the First World War.
Wow.
And I don't know how that's possible because, so many men were scarred physically and emotionally by what they saw. Teilhard apparently was not. He said the man on the battlefield is, the man who's experienced the battlefield is not the same man. He somehow rose above that. And so the seed that he had for writing or thinking about the noosphere was actually a mystical experience on a moonlit night on a battlefield in France during the First World War. And he first wrote this up with this, he called this strange term, the great monad. I don't really know what that means. And that eventually evolved into the idea of the noosphere. But the idea is that there's the geosphere, that's the physical Earth, and then the biosphere, which is a little ring around the geosphere where all living beings are. And it really is a thin little ring or shell. But Teilhard envisioned something beyond that, was sort of the collective consciousness rising from the earth and creating this sphere of collective consciousness that sort of was around the biosphere. And for a long time I thought, well, in some ways the internet is that. But unfortunately the internet there's so many problems associated with the internet now and fake news and all of that I don't want to tar the notion of the noosphere by likening it to the internet. But if you think about it, those shells, geosphere, biosphere, noosphere, that's a physical example for the idea of the Copernican revolutions. I mean, one has to do with our place in the physical world, the second with a place in the biological world, and the third in our place in the conscious world, the spiritual world, the psychic world.
You have a chapter about evolution increases in complexity, and that this somehow fits into the whole philosophical change we're undergoing. So what's the connection with increasing complexity to what we've been talking about?
Okay, so this gets complicated. So Teilhard he coined the term cosmogenesis, he coined the term noosphere, and he coined the term complexification or complexity consciousness. And cosmogenesis has to do with the universe being in a continual creation. So, when was the moment of creation? Well, it's now.
It's a circle.
Yeah, everything is being new things are being created all the time. So the cosmos is in a constant state of creation. Now, complexity consciousness is really what I call evolution with a capital E. Unlike many evolutionary biologists, Teilhard would say that evolution is not directionless. A lot of evolution is random. has to do with random mutations within the genes. But it's not all random. I would call it random with a bias. And that's because higher intelligence gives a creature, higher intelligence is adaptive. Human beings can live in outer space. They can live at the bottom of the Marianas Trench for a little while. They can live in the North Pole and the South Pole in all kinds of extremes. Why? Because we have enough consciousness to understand how to create take a habitat along with us, that what we need. So higher consciousness gives beings is an adaptive mechanism. And this is where Teilhard would depart, and I would depart from someone like Stephen Jay Gould, who I think is brilliant, but I think completely missed the obvious. He says, evolution is purposeless and directionless. And they use some other term there. To me, that's not a scientific statement. That's a dogmatic statement. It's really a religious statement. Because if you look at least at the history of evolution on the Earth, over time, beings of greater biological complexity are evolving, and one of the Nobel laureates, Sherrington, said, "With complexity comes mind. With higher biological complexity comes greater mental capacity." So Teilhard said, he said that evolution is not directionless, it's proceeding in a direction in fits and starts, no doubt, in fits and starts. But there's an arrow to it. There's an arrow to evolution, and it's in the direction of higher consciousness. So, if you look at the cosmos, if you take a God's eye view of the cosmos, there are two prevailing trends. One is the physical cosmos going to hell in a handbasket. That is, entropy is eventually going to make the energy resources unusable. The poet said, are we going to end with a bang or a whimper? Well, it looks like a whimper, when all the stars burn out, etc. So the thermodynamic notion of entropy states that in a closed system, entropy can only increase over time, meaning that the energy in the universe is becoming gradually less and less available. Stars give a lot of available energy. A black hole gives almost none because everything is trapped. So that's what's happening in the physical cosmos. It's running down. If you look at the biological cosmos, exactly the opposite is happening. We start from elementary particles that form atoms. The atoms form molecules. Molecules at some point form cells. The cells give rise to maybe RNA, which then gives rise to DNA, which then gives rise to replication, which then gives rise to complexification of biology, which gives rise to higher consciousness, etc., etc. So you've got these two trends going like this, and they look like they're exactly opposite to one another. So there's a $64,000 question that begs to be asked. Is there any relationship between these two trends? And the answer is yes. This one wouldn't happen without that one. And that's, you can make that connection scientifically. And we've only been able to make that connection scientifically since about 1965 or so with the new mathematical theory of dynamical systems, or chaos theory. But it turns out that you can get pockets of self-organization of higher complexity that seem to go against the entropic stream if there's certain things are happening in the physical world. That is, in those things, from a mathematical point of view, is the prevailing laws have to be nonlinear. Well, all the prevailing laws are nonlinear. That's a mathematical term, but it means that the input is not strictly proportional to the output. So biology is based on chemistry. Chemistry is strongly nonlinear because of catalytic actions and all of that kind of thing, feedback loops. You have to be far from equilibrium, meaning that using an analogy of a stream, you have to be, if you liken the entropic stream to a physical stream, you got to be nearer the headwaters than the ocean. It has to be a strong flow. And if you have a strong flow, then what you get is eddies in the stream. And in those eddies, situations can occur that where you get pockets that go against the tide of entropy. So you can have self-organization, things getting more complicated rather than less complicated. You can have complexification. And so there have been a theologian and a couple of, there's a book by Peter, called Peter Atkins, called Galileo's Finger. And he's got a chapter in there on entropy, and it's a wonderful chapter, and he's got these quotes about that we couldn't have the upward running of the evolutionary stream without the downward collapse of the sort of physical cosmos. That this is actually propelling that. So this is not some poet saying this. This is not that you can make a mathematical, physical connection here. That the two trends that appear to be going opposite directions, this trend is actually propelling them. So that would almost suggest then that, I mean, purpose is maybe too strong a word, but it would almost give a teleological notion to the cosmos in a way as a factory for a higher consciousness. Now, of course, I'm saying that living on planet Earth, where it's not clear what direction we're going right now, and of course, we don't know what's happening in other places. But I would have to think anywhere that higher consciousness would be adaptive in some way, no matter what the evolutionary mechanism. Now again, this is somewhat speculation, but a speculation that has at least the semblance of a foundation.
And how does the chaos theory or the math of 65 fit into this?
Well, there's several ways. Ilya Prigogine is a Nobel laureate in chemistry who studied self-organization in chemical systems. And for example, you can you can have chemical oscillators where a pH indicator will turn a solution some color depending on what the pH level of the solution is. Well, there are chemical oscillators that will go back and forth between colors. They'll oscillate back and forth. And they start out kind of randomly after a while, and then they lock into this very periodic back and forth. So there's sort of a self-organization going on among all of those atoms and molecules that's making this very precise. And Pruett, among others, have studied this self-organization of chemical systems. And it can happen under certain circumstances. And again, the circumstances are the underlying mechanism has to be nonlinear. You have to be far from equilibrium. And I always forget the third one. I forgot the third one. There's three. But we've learned that from studying chaos theory, and that's only been around since 1965 or 62 or 3. Now, there's another side to that chaos theory that's kind of interesting, too, because it also spells the death knell for determinism. So that's another one of the sacred cow, science's sacred cows: materialism, determinism, locality, absolute time and space, dualism, realism, reductionism. All of those sacred cows have died, except materialism, and it's on its last legs. Chaos theory helped kill off. Chaos theory and quantum mechanics combined kill off determinism. Okay. You can only have determinism if you know the governing equations and you also know the initial conditions with absolute precision. Chaos theory says quantum theory says you can't know the initial conditions with absolute precision, because anything that you do to determine the velocity will contaminate the position or vice versa. So you can only know within certain guidelines. And because many of the laws of the physical universe are nonlinear, they manifest chaotic behavior. So if you change the initial conditions the slightest bit, you change the outcome enormously. So if you can't precisely pin down those initial conditions, then you cannot predict what the future will be, because the future depends so intimately on those initial conditions. So that's another thing that chaos theory has done for us. It's really helped spell the death knell of determinism.
How does consciousness fit in here, if it does?
Well, that's a really good question, and I guess I've maybe lost that train of thought. And my gut tells me it does fit in, because let's go back to Dean Radin's experiments with the random number generators, okay? If you take those on face value, and I do, because I've met him, I think he's a very careful experimentalist. Other people have replicated this stuff. Apparently, a conscious focus or conscious intent can have an effect on random numbers. Now, it's a small effect; it's a tiny effect, but nevertheless, it survives statistical analysis, okay? Particularly if you combine lots of these experiments together in a meta-analysis. Well, so, if consciousness can affect something at the quantum level, but the indeterminacy of the quantum level determines what's going to happen in the long-term evolution of things, then what I'm doing is affecting the long-term evolution. Now, I give my students another example of this. And this has to do with absolute time and space. Newton hypothesized that we have absolute time and we have absolute space. So space is like the stage in a play on which all of physical events happen. And time is independent of all that, just clicking away. So Einstein says, well, sorry, but time and space are intertwined in some strange way. That's special relativity. And he says, oh, by the way, space is fluid. It's more of a web. And that our interactions affect the web. Mass tells space-time how to bend or how to warp, and space-time tells mass how to move. So there's now an interaction between the players and the stage. Mm. Now, to bend space-time, it has to be a very, very massive object to bend it a lot, like a black hole. So I'm not going to bend space-time a whole lot, nor are you, nor are the cat. Well, she's pretty massive, nor is the cat.
Sweet.
But we'll bend it a little bit. And in a nonlinear dynamical world where little changes have long-term consequences, you don't know what you're doing. So I tell my students when they're leaving the class where we've talked about this, the warpage of space-time, that when you're going home to the dorm or to lunch, you're sending little ripples out through the cosmos. and that's changing the evolution of the future. And that used to be a game until 2 years ago, when gravity waves were actually detected by the LIGO experiment. So we now know that Einstein's hypothesized gravity waves are real, and there really are ripples emanating through the cosmos. Now, the ones we detected were from black holes merging. But, I mean, so I, as a conscious being, by walking along and sending little ripples out through this cosmic web. And by the way, the web of life is another Native American idea. So we live in this web. We live in this cosmic web. And the web is not independent of us. And we're not independent of the web.
Well, I interviewed Brian Josephson, the physicist, and he was making a link between the biological evolutionary system and I guess the physics system, and I wasn't quite sure where the connection was, but I guess system is the key word.
Well, it sounds a little bit like he's talking about what I was trying to say about the running down of the
entropy.
The stream of entropy and the evolutionary stream going opposite directions. I don't know if he's making that connection or not.
Well, you say that love is woven into the fabric of the world in terms, I guess, of that we create and are altruistic. Is that what you mean?
Okay, so that's a real stretch on my part, okay? But I think let's make it anyway. So you can talk about entropy in the abstract. in some physical universe without human beings. Let's talk about entropy in the universe of human beings. Okay? Suppose I have a hobby, which is restoring old cars. And I go to a junkyard and I buy an old 57 Chevy that's all rusted and fabric's all torn and the wheels are rotted. And I spend the better part of a year in the garage getting the rust off and having parts chromed and so forth and so forth. What I'm doing is a counter-entropic exercise. Now, the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, doesn't say that you can't create order out of disorder. It says that you can't do that in a closed system. You have to have a source of energy from outside. So in that garage, without me, that car would just continue to decay. So I bring my outside energy into this and turn that thing on its head and work opposite of entropy. I would say a gardener does the same thing. A garden is going to quickly become a tangle of weeds or and not very aesthetic, probably if left to its own devices. But a gardener, is introducing some beauty and some order into what could be very disordered. Another example is parenting. A child without a parent doesn't live long. Can't feed itself, can't change itself. And so the process, if that child were in an isolated environment, then that living being is going to die, it's going to decay very quickly. So there has to be this energy coming from outside. Well, in that context, we know what to call that energy from outside. That's the love of the parent. Okay. So in a human context, not in the physical world, but in the human context, we call all of these counter-entropic things, we call them labors of love. Okay? Whether it's a love for the old car, love of gardening, or love for a child. They're all labors of love. They require an input of energy from the outside in order to stave off the natural tendency toward decay. So now let's back up to cosmogenesis and look at the whole universe. Well, there are two trends. One is the running down trend, and the other is the counter-entropic trend of evolution and higher consciousness. And this trend couldn't happen without this trend. So it's almost as if the physical world is sacrificing itself in some way for the biological conscious world. This world's going to hell in the handbasket so that this one can go the other direction.
Oh, I see. So that's the love part.
Yeah. So, and there's that great quote by Teilhard. It's in the beginning of one of the chapters in the book on Teilhard about the labor of the seaweed. The industry of the bees as they make honey from the juices broadcast in so many flowers. The labor of the seaweed as it does something. These are but pale images of the ceaseless working over that all the forces of the cosmos undergo in us in order to attain the level of the spirit. So he's saying that the whole cosmos is acting as a distillery of consciousness.
Interesting.
Now that's very different than saying evolution is purposeless and directionless.
This is a footnote. I'm really interested in dark energy and dark matter because it's 95% of the universe. But do you have any idea what it actually is?
No, but I'll lay one conjecture out there for you that's not, I don't think, related. It could conceivably be. So I was actually an engineering undergrad major. And in engineering, you learn that mass is conserved, momentum is conserved, and energy is conserved. So you kind of come to the conclusion that everything is conserved. And then in about your junior year, you hit upon entropy. Guess what? Entropy is not conserved. In a closed system, it always stays the same or increases. That seems just really bizarre at first. So we know that the physical entropy of the cosmos is increasing. And that's measurable, that's quantifiable.
Does expansion equal entropy because the universe is expanding?
That's beyond my pay grade, but when a star collapses, I don't know how the expansion or contraction of the cosmos quite gets into the picture. And actually, Stephen Hawking got it wrong. He said and he admitted this, he thought that if the universe quit expanding and started contracting, that the arrow of entropy would turn. And then he later concluded that it wouldn't. So if he can't get it right, I'm not going to go there. But there is something that is a possibility. When Shannon, I forget, and others started coming up with the communications theory, the entropy winds up also in the field of communications, which is the conveying of information. So an information theory also has an idea of entropy involved with it. So my conjecture, and this is just a conjecture, make sure it's flagged with lots of asterisks, okay? So maybe entropy is conserved, and that there's two pieces to it. That there's a physical piece, and that's the only piece that we're aware of now. And there's an informational piece, which has to do with consciousness. And that the increase in entropy in the physical world is what's driving the decrease in entropy in the informational world or the conscious world. And actually, Teilhard, like I said, no idea is new. Teilhard talked about something similar to this. He talks about energy as having two components, a radial energy and a tangential energy. And it was very vague, and it was not scientific at all. But you got the impression that he was really talking about entropy more than energy here, and that, well, again, it may be that we just don't have a full understanding of this whole notion of entropy yet, because it seems counterintuitive to everything else we know. Everything else seems to be conserved, and entropy is not. So it's unusual.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. Where and when were you born?
Oh, okay. Well, I was born in Durham, North Carolina. My dad had just come back from the Second World War, where he saw some pretty heavy fighting at the end of the war, and helped liberate the concentration camp at Dachau.
Wow.
He had gone to 2 years in Emory and Henry. This is actually his sweatshirt I have on. He died 5 years ago. He was able to continue his education on the GI Bill. He did that at Duke, and then he went on to medical school. So he was the first one on either side of the family to get a college degree, much less a medical degree. Then when we were 2, when I was 2, we moved to Richmond. We lived there for a year while he was doing internship or residency. I always get them confused, at the Medical College of Virginia. Then we moved to Bluefield, West Virginia, which Mom was from Bluefield, West Virginia, Dad from Bluefield, Virginia, and both of my parents lived there till they passed away. I graduated from high school there and then really never moved back. So I grew up not in the coal fields of West Virginia, but on the edge of the coal fields in a relatively affluent town that nevertheless, since I left, has fallen on hard times.
What month and year were you born?
June 28th, so I'm a Cancer. But I haven't really paid any attention to astrology.
Do you know any of your, like, Myers-Briggs or Enneagram personality types?
Yeah, Myers-Briggs, I'm an INFJ. Introverted, intuitive, feeling, and
judging.
Yeah.
You know, everybody that I know, their score is intuitive. So my hypothesis is people who do this kind of work are intuitives. It'll be interesting when I get scores from everybody that I've interviewed.
Yeah. Enneagram, I think I dabbled with that at a conference once upon a time, but I never did any more with it, and I can't recall any of that.
And then what made you decide were you in electrical engineering?
No, I was in mechanical engineering. As a kid, I grew up doing the space race, and I was enamored of science and particularly space. I mean, rocketry. My best friend and I did model rocketry, and I built a wind tunnel for a science project, and so I thought I was going to be an aerospace engineer. That was what I wanted to do when I was in junior high school. When I got to college, I thought, well, maybe mechanical engineering is a little broader. Engineering was so narrow, though, I just about bailed my senior year because it was just math and science completely. And so at the time, I think I mentioned on the questionnaire, my dad was not particularly religious. He had incredibly high ethical standards, and was very rational, very scientific. My mom was a Southern Baptist, very religious. Mom had only acquired a year of college, and she'd never lived away from Bluefield except for Durham, North Carolina, and a year in Richmond. So her world was very, very prescribed, if that's the term. And it wasn't for a lack of intelligence. Mom was a very bright woman, but the opportunities to grow that world never really came her way. There was a lot of dysfunction in the family, and well, anybody who's had a doctor for a father can tell you that doctors are very preoccupied and very godlike. So Dad in those days was sort of almost unapproachable for me. Mom was very needy, so I got sucked into her orbit, which was not at all healthy for me in retrospect. But her orbit was very, very religious. And actually, in doing the questionnaire, I was thinking Mom was quite intuitive in ways that don't necessarily jive with her Southern Baptist background, because she was actually a believer in parapsychology. But in the Southern Baptist circles, that would almost be thought of as,
satanic or something.
Satanic, yeah. So anyway, I was torn between these, the scientific pole on the one hand and the spiritual pole on the other. And this was also during the time of Vietnam. And I did not have a very well-developed social conscience. I grew up in West Virginia, which was God country, and it, you don't burn the flag and that kind of thing. So I was looking for a way not to go to Vietnam as a ground troop, but I didn't have enough social conscience to say,
conscientious objector.
Yeah, to be a CO. So I actually thought about divinity school for a while, and in retrospect, that would have been an absolute and total disaster. In college, I was very active in the Baptist Student Union and lay retreats and things like that. I was on a folk team, on a work camp. Anyway, there was this tug between those poles, and I didn't really begin to resolve that tug until midlife. So what happened is I kept toggling back and forth between, so I majored in engineering, spent a couple years in the Air Force, and I wound up teaching high school mathematics with an engineering degree out of the Air Force. Then I go to work for NASA Langley for 2 years. Then I go to graduate school in applied math. Then I go back to NASA Langley. Eventually I wound up at the University of Arizona. And then when I got out of the University of Arizona, I wound up teaching at Virginia Commonwealth University for 3 years. So in some sense, teaching for me was the beginning of a way to merge what felt like a kind of service with my scientific mathematical inclinations. I had a bad experience at VCU, not with VCU, but with the department I was in. And so I wound up going back to NASA Langley thinking I'd be there for a couple of years, and I was there 6.5. So I didn't arrive at James Madison University till I was 47. Didn't become a father until I was I became a father right before we came here. So I was a first-time father at 47 and a new career at 47.
Wow.
So you can see that it took me a while to begin to pull it together. But the part of this I left out is when I was living in Richmond, I stumbled, and I really think this was a synchronous event, onto a mentor who would really deeply touch my life, and he was in my life for 8 years until he died in 1995 at the age of about 82 or so. His name was John Youngblood, and John touched my life deeply, and he helped me become aware of the competition of the poles, and also find the courage to be faithful to both of them rather than to try to choose one or the other. And he gave that struggle a name, the mystical struggle. Teilhard experienced that, Jung experienced that. And if one can live with that tension, even though it feels like it's going to tear you apart sometimes, the resolution of that tension can give rise to something that transcends either pole. Jung's protege, Mary Louise von Franz, talked about that. If you can live with the tensions of opposites long enough, you can give birth to something wholly transparent, I think is the way she phrased that. And John nurtured into me sort of my mystical impulses, and I began to think about this course that I eventually wound up teaching as an honors course at JMU. And then the book that I wrote came ultimately from the course. If it weren't for John, neither one of those things would have happened. And I consider those the two most significant things I've done in my life.
Was he a therapist?
John was a spiritual counselor. He was a therapist, but he had studied Jung. He studied Teilhard. Well, let me back up. I'll tell you more of his story. John went to Harvard Divinity School and was an Episcopalian priest until he was 44 years of age. He had a recurring dream that his vestments were a straitjacket. And I told him, John, I can interpret that dream. And so he left the ministry. He became a Quaker. He moved to Atlanta, Georgia, became involved in the civil rights movement, knew Martin Luther King Jr. personally, was arrested in the civil rights movement, and the remainder of his life, he wrote books and led retreats and individually counseled people. And he wrote a book called The Gentle Art of Spiritual Guidance. So what John tried to help people do was not so much what a psychotherapist would do, help you find your demons or heal them, heal your wounds, find your demons. John was trying to help people find their thread, what he called their thread, being on your thread. So he would look for what someone is passionate about, and then he was able to sort of bless that passion. He was a father figure to a lot of people, and he was able to, like when God told Jesus, "This is my son of whom I'm well pleased." That's what we would all like our fathers to do for us, but most fathers most father-son relationships or father-daughter relationships fall far short of that. And fathers don't always recognize that passion in the child and bless it. Well, John did, and he did that for many, many people. And so originally it was a correspondence that we had, and then eventually I would go stay with him for weekends at a time. And there were some beautiful moments together. He was a student of Teilhard, and Teilhard had written this wonderful thing called the Mass on the World. It's actually a mass to celebrating the materialism of the earth and the spirituality of the earth. But John used to like to watch Dan Rather on the evening news, and so he would call that the Mass on the World, and we would sit and drink Bass ale and watch the Mass on the world. Anyway, I digress. But you asked me to tell you about me. Anyway, without John, I probably wouldn't have accomplished the things that I feel are my two major accomplishments. One is this honors course at JMU called From Black Elk to Black Holes, Tales of a Mysterious Universe. And the other is related, but not a direct translation. It's the book, Reason and Wonder. From Black Elk to Black Holes. Black Elk in the title refers to Nicholas Black Elk, the Lakota shaman or holy man. Black holes refers to, of course, one of the components of Big Bang cosmology. And so the idea in the course was to look at the universe from two diametrically opposed perspectives, from a mythological perspective on the one hand, a scientific perspective on the other hand, and then to see if we could find any way to bridge that gulf. In other words, I'm asking the students to sort of do what I've been trying to do in my life, is to merge the spiritual and the material. And I had no idea whether it would work, but it worked beautifully, particularly the very first time. I had to listen to all my better angels. because it was, the first time I taught the course, and there was a lot to process, and I just had to listen to the better angels, and the course was beautifully received. It eventually got a Templeton Foundation Science Religion Course Award. I taught it a total of 7 times. I got the Provost First Award at the university for honors teaching because of the course. But that's all secondary. It's the comments of the students over time that have meant the most to me, and many students say it's been a life-changing course for them. And I hear from students years and years after the fact, thanking me for it. So that's an accomplishment I'm proud of. And the other one is that the book I originally thought was going to be a translation of the course, but the course was too big for the book, and I had to trim. And unfortunately, one of the things that got trimmed was the Native American component, which really survives only in the preface and then a little bit in the later part of the book. But that influence is throughout. The influence is throughout. It's just that the book became unwieldy.
Do you have another book that you're thinking about?
Everything in me wants to tell you yes. And if it's there, it's not speaking to me. The one thought I have is that, there's a sad story there. My mentor, John Youngblood, left a lot of unpublished papers. And a friend and I were tasked with publishing those. And then the person who tasked us with publishing those essentially pulled the plug on us, or made it so miserable for us that we had to pull our own plug. So that hurt. And I won't go into that in any more detail. But the one thing I've thought about is that the final exam in this honors course was interesting. You talked to Henry about his book, Channeling Your Highest Self. The final exam in the course was to write a letter to assume that one is at the end of one's life, 81 years of age, and to write a letter to a beloved grandchild expressing the wisdom that you would like to give them in a couple of pages. And the first time I did this, I cannot tell you how blown out of the water I was by the wisdom of these students. When you ask them to put themselves in this place of an elder, the wisdom that they come up with is extraordinary. And so what I would like to do is to collect this wisdom and to edit it into a volume. The problem is that it's been 20 years since I first taught the course, and I only started saving all of these towards the end of the teaching it, so I don't know how many of these I could retrieve. But that would be a project worth doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do for fun besides play the guitar, and maybe you actually do refurbish old vehicles?
No, I don't do that.
Okay.
No, I create old vehicles.
Okay.
I get new cars and drive them until they fall apart. I've been section hiking the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. Not the whole trail, but Virginia has 1/4 of the whole Appalachian Trail. The AT is 2,200 miles long, and Virginia has 550 miles of those. And I'm within 65 to 75 miles of finishing Virginia. And that's not easy at 70 years of age. Might not be wise either, but I've enjoyed it.
And did you have more than one child, or you just had one?
I've done everything late. I mean, all this complication with vocation that I talked about, well, it had other complications too, relationships and becoming a parent. I was a late bloomer in every way. I got my Ph.D. at 38. I married at 39, became a father at 47. Ellie is our only child. She's 23. Wouldn't have missed it for the world. Yeah. So, what do I do for fun? Used to do photography. I don't do that anymore. iPhones have ruined that. And I used to write poetry. I'd like to get back into that. I don't know if I still have what it takes, but I'd like to do that. I like to travel, but I actually prefer, particularly with European travel, I actually prefer going and working somewhere, like having a research appointment for 2 or 3 weeks and being plugged in that way rather than being a pure tourist.
How have you coped with the difficult times in your life besides having a mentor? What else? Do you meditate? How have you gotten through difficult times?
Well, I've been in counseling or therapy from time to time. That's helped a lot. Of course, the quality of counseling and therapy varies tremendously, so it's important to find the right person. I've also, over the years, gifted myself, usually about once a year, with a conference that really feeds my spirit. And over the years, I've been to workshops with Matthew Fox, who's the leading mystical theologian in the country. 2000, I went to one of the first Science and Consciousness conferences. It was in Albuquerque. It was a great conference. You mentioned Houston Smith in what you sent me. I met Houston Smith at that conference. And even though I was only in his presence for about 2 minutes, it was a significant 2 minutes. I've been to 2 of the SAND conferences in recent years.
What's SAND?
That's the Science in Non-Duality.
Mm.
And those are not too far from you. They're in, let's see, what's south of San Francisco at the bottom of the bay?
Is Menlo Park, San Jose?
San Jose.
Uh-huh.
Those take place in San Jose, California. I mentioned Larry LeShan meditation workshop I went to. I've been to that Sedona retreat with Henry Reed. That was very powerful. So about once a year, I try to do something like that really feeds my spirit. Some of these things take, and some of them don't. For example, that Advent retreat I went to with John Youngblood. That's the one that put me on the path to the mentorship with John. Yeah, things that nurture the spirit are all good, helpful.
Right. Last question. In the face of climate change and Trump and the Trump clones around the world, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Oh boy. Depends on which day you ask me. Reminds me of the quip of one of the quantum physicists who said on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays we teach the particle theory of light, and on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays we teach the wave theory. There's a lot to be optimistic about, and there's a lot to be terrified about, and in my optimistic moments, I hope that Trump and all the reactionary forces are just the last gasp of the old paradigm. And I even think sometimes of the notion of the Native American notion of the trickster. Mm. We tend to think of heroes and villains, but the trickster is kind of this in-between character that can sometimes produce good by wreaking havoc. And I don't really think of Trump in that way, but it's in essence he's pulling the scab off of a lot of wounds. But the fact that the wounds were never treated, particularly, I've realized we've never come to grips with the Civil War. I mean, and the Black Lives Matter is bringing that to the fore, and all the young black men that are being shot by policemen, and all of the racial things that are going on just make me realize that we never had anything like a reconciliation, a genuine reconciliation after the Civil War. And so those wounds are not healed. So maybe bringing this stuff to the surface again can get us there, but so far it hasn't. We're just throwing stones at one another. And I think I mentioned in the written response that Teilhard had an interesting perspective. He wasn't sure whether humans would survive or not. He was fairly optimistic and thought we would, but if we didn't, we are not the end point of evolution. We just think we are, because we may be at the top of the evolutionary tree at the moment, but the tree is still growing, and who knows what will be there. He coined the term the omega point, which was a point on the distant horizon. If evolution is directional and it's going towards higher consciousness, then who knows what, then it's pointing at some point on the horizon, and it's unlikely that that's us, the end point. So, maybe we're stepping stones to something else, because we're screwing up pretty royally right now.
Yeah.
Where I'm most pessimistic because I came to fatherhood late and have a 23-year-old daughter. I'm 70. So I'm going to pass before the worst of climate change. But my concern is that the climate is going to destabilize our political system before the planet becomes unlivable. And I don't know what my daughter faces, and I want her to have a viable future. She deserves that. And it just, at a time when most people, if they don't know it here, they know it in their gut, that what is happening on the earth is not normal in terms of climate, and that we're just, we're fouling our nest and we're destroying our habitat. Most people either know that rationally or they know it in their gut. And yet there are a few bad actors that are keeping us from taking the initiatives we need. I mean, there's the CEOs, there's ExxonMobil that was engaged in a disinformation campaign for about 2 decades. And there's all the politicians that are taking money from the oil companies. It's pretty amazing that 10 or so years ago, Newt Gingrich and Hillary Clinton made a joint ad together, a public service announcement about climate change, that we needed to address it, and yet all of the GOP have become climate deniers. And it's because they're being paid to deny, for most of them. And then there's the paid people who masquerade as scientists and go around on the lecture circuit, and the average person doesn't realize whether they're talking to a legitimate climate scientist or a paid denier. So that issue is really troubling to me. But there are an awful lot of good signs on the horizon there as well. I mean, the Green New Deal that's floating in Congress is a really hopeful sign. And the fact that in the last year, 8% of the American public has turned around on climate, and that's been after witnessing some of these horrific events, hurricanes that the climate scientists have been predicting for 40 years now. I don't know, Gail. Some days I'm hopeful, other days I'm not. But I guess the bottom line is, even a pessimist, the only option we have is to choose hope. I mean, ultimately, it's a choice. And, I can't completely throw up my hands, because if I do that, I'm part of the, I'm part of the problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much.